Christian Asifa, and for the technical expertise of Austin Smith at UC Merced. And not the least, a profound thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us this afternoon. So we encourage everyone to follow this afternoon's conversation online by using the hashtag CRSC Goudeau and on Twitter at Critical Refugee Studies. And please tag us on your tweets. All registered participants have been entered in for a raffle to win a copy of Jessica Goudeau's book and a CRSC swag bag. The winner of the raffle will be announced after the Q&A. In many ways, this conversation is timely and significant as we head into June, which is the World Refugee Awareness Month. With this in mind, we envision this conversation as paving the way for our sustained engagement with the issues of global displacement that is among the most pressing of our times. For it is important that the focus on global refugees not begin and end in that 1 month. As a preface for our critical and deep reflections about these issues, I can think of no better place to start than this. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Nigel Hatton, who will introduce Jessica Goudeau and lead us through this afternoon's program. Professor Nigel Hatton is Associate Professor of Literature in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of California, Merced. He teaches courses and writes about the intersections of human rights and literature. Professor Hatan is also a founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, and it is my honor to call him my colleague and friend. I will now pass this on to Professor Hatan. Thank you.
Dr. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the amazing opening to this wonderful event that I've greatly anticipated. It is a pleasure to be here with our audience and especially with our esteemed guest, Jessica Goudeau. Dr. Jessica Goudeau is the author of After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America, which won the 2021 J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize. That prize recognizes excellence in nonfiction that exemplifies the literary grace and commitment to serious research and social concern. Over the course of 30 chapters in After the Last Border, this nonfiction book tells the stories of two refugee families and their experiences with resettlement in the United States, and details that signify the radical listening on behalf of the storyteller, Dr. Goudeau. We learn about Muna, a Christian from Myanmar, and Hasna, a Muslim woman from Syria. Their stories are framed and contextualized by histories of war and displacement, the stories of humanitarianism, global refugee policies, and American resettlement policy. I noted that the book is organized in the form of a prologue followed by 30 chapters. Indeed, that is that same structure that we see in documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the book offering us a way to understand humanitarianism through the stories of those who are at the center. After the Last Border also won a Christopher Award and was named a New York Times Editor's Choice book. Dr. Goudeau has also written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Teen Vogue, as well as many other venues. She's a former columnist for Catapult. She has produced projects for Teen Vogue, for example, Ask a Syrian Girl, and A Line Birds Cannot See, a documentary about a young girl who crossed the border into the US on her own. This was distributed by The New Yorker. Dr. Goudeau has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas. I want to talk to her about that. She has served as a Mellon Writing Fellow and interim writing center director at Southwestern University, and is a visiting professor at Sewanee School of Letters. She spent more than a decade working with refugees in Austin, Texas, and was the co-founder of Hill Tribers, a nonprofit that provided supplemental income for Burmese refugee artisans for 7 years. After the Last Border, after it was published, received glowing praise in several publications. The New York Times, Mimi Swartz writes, reading After the Last Border will make you wish that more Americans would take a critical look at themselves and ask whether we are who we want to be, or whether we have lost our allegiance to the dreams that still inspire so many to try to reach our shores. In Kirkus Reviews, they wrote, in a detailed text that moves smoothly around in time, Goudeau effectively humanizes the worldwide refugee crisis while calling much needed attention to a badly broken American immigration system. It is an extreme pleasure to have Dr. Goudeau with us here today and to be in dialogue with her and with the Critical Refugee Studies Collective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Goudeau, who will now read from her award-winning book, After the Last Border.
Well, first, I just want to thank you all so much for having me today. I have been looking forward to this event since we began planning it several weeks ago, and I especially want to thank those of you in the collective for the extraordinary work that you were doing, not just in this event, but in moving the conversation forward in such critical and complicated ways when we think about refugee studies. And I especially want to thank Christiane for your work in organizing this event. So thank you guys so much for having me. So this is going to be my last event for a while, which is nice on purpose. And I'm so glad that I get to end with you because I think that this discussion might be one of the most important that we can have. And in our conversation, just kind of our little prep conversation before this, Nigel and I were talking about which part to read in the book. And I decided to read a part that I haven't ever read before, which is nice. And it's about the hoopoe. There's a scene in here, and so I want to give you just a little bit of background to kind of explain it. So first of all, this is my book, but I learned early on that if I read, you just see the top of my head. So I'm actually going to read from a PDF on my computer so that you can see my face. Zoom book events are so weird. So this is the hack that I figured out. In this, so as Nigel told you, there are two women that this book is about. One is Muna, and she's from Myanmar, and we can talk more about her story later. But this part comes from Hasna, who left Daraa, Syria. So the war began in Daraa with a series of protests around children. And Hasna made the very difficult decision to leave her home city. And this is while she and her family are still in the city of Ramtha, which is right across the border from Daraa. And so this is a moment as she's really struggling with the idea that she has to become a refugee in order to let her daughter go to school and so they can get services. And for her, this feels like a real break from the person that she was in the past. She had never imagined that she would ever be in a situation in which she would ever have to claim the title of refugee. And so her daughter, Layla, has been with her in Ramtha, and Layla's husband, Malek, went back into Syria to get his family and bring all of them across the border. So that's where we are, kind of waiting in Ramtha for word that they've arrived at the border. At 1 a.m. on the night he was scheduled to arrive, Malek called. The first phone call he had been able to make for months, which meant he was in Jordanian space. Hasna had gone to bed, but Layla had stayed awake on the couch, searching through social media, a novelty none of them had had in Syria, and now the most reliable source of their news, and texting over WhatsApp with Malek's parents and siblings. They texted as soon as they arrived. All of their families had made it past the border, thanks be to Allah, but the guards had stopped Malek, only him. He should have been a few minutes behind them. The group text had gone quiet after a while, and they did not reply to her repeated questions. They had crossed at Zatari camp, 2 hours away from Ramtha, where guards were now rerouting all refugees trying to enter Jordan. When she heard Layla's voice, Hasna came out of her bedroom, pulling her hair back with a scrunchie and tugging her housecoat closed around her. Yusuf, so their other son, was visiting from Mafraq for a few days, and he was asleep on the floor of Hasna's bedroom. Hasna could hear the rough timbre of Malek's voice. Layla clutched at the phone, her voice rising with each response. What? What do they want? Now? It's 2 hours away. Can you wait? Make them wait. We are coming. I love you, Habibi. Hold on. We are coming. Layla hung up, and Hasna was already moving. Layla was still dressed. She did not keep her voice down. Mama, they've detained him. Get Yusuf. I'm getting Hamad. That's her baby son. Here's a toddler. They have to let him stay. Her voice at the end of the sentence was a squeak. Yusuf, the brother, awoke immediately, pulled on his clothes and splashed water in his face. Amal, another sister, came out of her room as well, and they walked down together. Yusuf pulled the motorcycle he shared with their other brother out of the shed on the side of the villa where he had locked it away. Layla straddled the back of the bike, took Hamad from her mother, and tucked him between her body and her brother's back. Hamad, Layla's son, held onto Yusuf's coat with his tiny fists. Hasna kissed them all. The motorcycle roared away into the night. Amal and Hasna went to their prayer rugs and began to pray. They did not stop until the sky was graying into morning and the younger children woke up. Yusuf told his mother later what happened. They had found Malik's family first, and they pointed to the guard station a few meters from the border. Layla walked over to the guards, holding Hamad. Malik had all of his paperwork in order. He had left legally. There were no concerns against him. What was the reason that he could not enter? She demanded of the guards. They shrugged. No one was sure. It was someone else's decision. She tried to reason with him, but none of the guards would listen. They were obdurate. They pointed to a bus idling nearby where she could see Malik's face pressed against the window. The bus faced towards Syria. He's right there. Please let me at least say something to him. Can I at least see him? Can he hold his son? The soldier began to look away. Her begging only made things worse, but she couldn't help herself. Hamad began crying for Malik, who held his hand on the glass as if the window might dissolve and allow him to join his son and wife in safety. Everything welling up in Layla burst. Her voice ringing out over the guards, she cursed every inch of the country of Jordan. She began with the soldier in front of her, cursing his mother and his sons and every one of his brothers. She cursed the officers of the Jordanian army who could look at a devout woman and tell her that her son's father could not be with them. She cursed the land around them, this God-forsaken desert that would never enjoy the verdant landscape of her beloved Syria. She cursed it that it might never produce fruit of any kind. She cursed the camp they had set up to keep the people of Syria out of cities and away from the help they needed. She cursed the government that did not intervene when Bashar al-Assad began bombing Daraa and Homs and Aleppo and Damascus. And she cursed the Jordanian king, the fucker of too many wives who sat in his palace doing nothing, surrounded by his fat, lazy sons, while these soldiers were taking her son's father away, were watching with their hands on their copious bellies while her country was destroyed. By then, Yusuf's hands were on her shoulders. The bus was starting up, and the acrid smell of diesel fuel mixed hotly with the snot pouring out of her nose. Tears tracked through the dust on her face. She let out a primal scream as the bus pulled away. Malik was right here in front of her, and then he was gone. The bus rolled back towards Syria. No one was surprised when Layla announced that she was going back to Daraa. It would be easier to negotiate peace with Assad than convince Layla to stay away from her husband. Hasna was not sure it was the right decision, but she knew it was not hers to make. Hasna spent almost every moment of the next 2 weeks near Layla and Hamad, soaking them in. She held Hamad while he napped. She toyed with his dark curls. His eyelashes against his cheeks were long and thick. The hair at the base of his neck was damp with sweat, and he breathed with his mouth open slightly. She prayed ceaselessly that Allah would protect this little man, that his feet would be swift if he needed to run, that his mouth would be quiet when he was in danger, that his eyes would not see anything that would hurt him, that his hands would pass kindness to the people he met, that his heart might remain pure no matter what happened. She did not fight with Layla in their last days together. She helped them pack, bought her the clothes and shoes she and Hamad would need for the next several months. She gave Layla a few ounces of gold, some insurance for the months to come. When the morning came for them to leave, Hasna and Layla hugged each other tightly before she clambered onto the van. Amal openly sobbed. She had never lived more than a few blocks away from her sister. Noor and Maria wailed, Amal's daughters. Their cousin had felt more like a brother for the last year, and they could not understand his leaving. Hasna told Layla over and over again that this was not the last time they were seeing each other, that they would find a new way to come back, even if it wasn't through the legal channels. She and Malik were two of the savviest, strongest people she knew. They would find a way. The words were hollow in her mouth. As Layla pulled away in the van, Hasna felt guilt stab her heart. She had promised Malik she would keep Layla safe, and she had already broken that promise. 2 days later, one of the boys who lived in another apartment in the villa knocked on her door. So in the past, Hasna has watched this little family of hoopos begin to grow. His hands cupped around something held against his shirt. "Auntie, we are sorry. We have hurt your bird." He opened his hands and she saw the mother hoopoe blinking dazedly. Her legs dangled at impossible angles. "What happened?" Hasna's voice rose. "They were throwing rocks and we hit the birds. Here the little boy gestured with his chin to 3 boys standing sheepishly behind him. "They didn't know those were your birds. I told them, but it was too late. We've hurt this one. I'm so sorry." Hasna looked in his gray eyes and wondered what would happen to this boy who was not afraid to confess, who had observed her closely enough to know that she'd grown to care about these birds. He could have left the bird to die. No one would ever have known. I'll take her. Hasna tugged on the dish towel that she had put on her shoulder and wrapped it gently around the bird. The bird's chest rose and fell shallowly. Hasna was careful not to touch her legs, hanging limply from her body. She was unsure what she could do, but she nodded gravely at the boys and closed the door with her heel. In the kitchen, she laid the bird on the dish towel beside the stove, where she had the best light from the picture window. No wild creature successfully succumbed so easily to being touched by humans unless it was past the point of fighting. They had remained apart for so many weeks as she had observed it, and now here they were, and probably beside each other in this kitchen in Ramtha. Hasna wrapped the broken legs carefully with a paper towel, securing the tiny bandages with a bit of electrical tape. She had no idea if the makeshift leg braces would stay, but she had to try. Hasna gathered the bird up, held it cradled against her belly, carried her up the stairs. She had never gone this close to the nest before. She could barely see through the tears streaming down her face. There were the 5 gangly babies. Hasna has 5 kids. They would not be able to take care of themselves. Those boys and their rock had condemned the children to death with their mother. Tenderly, she placed the mother inside the edge of the nest. The babies screeched in terror as Hasna's enormous shadow blocked out the sun. When she pulled back, they pushed against their mother's familiar body with their beaks, searching for food or comfort or her familiar scent, now mixed with Hasna's. They would never see their father again. Hasna knew that male hoopoes left the area when their mates died, never to return. Hasna sat down on a pile of tiles and her body shook with sobs, her face turned towards Syria. She could hear the frantic cries of the 5 baby birds. She sat vigil with them as their mother died. She stayed up on the roof, back aching as the sun set. Eventually, the babies were silent as well. She could hear occasional cars, the street dogs snapping and barking at each other in the field below, the wind through the low trees around her, the muffled explosions as the missiles started up in Daraa again. That night, the only lights were from the city of Ramtha behind her, the bombs flaring in Daraa before her, and the stars above. I think it's, there you go, yeah.
Thank you for reading that section of the book. It is filled with such intense detail. And one of the things that we emphasize or focus on as a collective is thinking about refugees as knowledge producers who come and know and tell stories, and in those stories, from those stories, we can extract epistemologies in which they produce knowledge. And the metaphors, the symbols, the details that are within that section of the book, indeed, for me, reflect a type of knowledge production. And one might miss that fact or the production of that knowledge and to see that as just merely the describing of a scene, but there's so much taking place within that description, and it's that production of knowledge, and it's the way in which those details form to show what Hasna is aware of, or what Hasna prophetically can anticipate, or what she's reflecting on, that I think is quite profound. So thank you for reading that intense section of the book. At this point, I'd like to start a dialogue with you about the book and also your work with refugee communities. I'll ask some questions and then open it up for the audience. But to begin, I wanted to ask about Hasna and Muna and their families, who feature prominently in your book, and to ask how they are doing. If you remain in contact with them, how are they now in the time after the publication of the book? So if you could talk about whether you remain in contact with them and how they're doing, and then to talk to us about how it came to be that you would tell their stories in this book that has now met with great acclaim. How did it come to be that you would tell their stories? Or as you write in the book, how would it come to be that you are a co-writer of their stories, right? Because that is something that is quite important for you. So if you could perhaps begin by talking to us about Una and Hasna now, and also how it came to be that you featured them in your book.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to flip the order of this because I think it helps. When I am very much in relationship with them currently. It is that we've had a long text today because it's the end of Ramadan, and so we have spent a lot of time texting with each other, and with Layla as well. And so I'll kind of give the answer of how I came into this work, and then talk about what the relationship looks like. So Muna, when I was getting my I was doing graduate work here. That's what brought us to Austin in the first place. And while I was here, I encountered a group of people. I'd lived all over the world and taught ESL all over the world between undergrad and graduate. And so I was translating in Spanish for a healthcare initiative at a fall festival at a community center when I encountered people that looked like they were from the same region that I had seen in northern Thailand when I taught there years ago. And I was so flabbergasted by that. I wasn't sure exactly where this group of people came from. And the very first person I met was Muna. And so for me, I think it's very important to understand that this work happens relationally. Muna and I have been friends since my oldest daughter was a baby, and since her children, who are now almost college age, were young, and this relationship built over time. So in the bio, you mentioned that I ran a nonprofit. It was a nonprofit is a very generous word for what we did. I mean, it was actually, we had a 501c3, but it was just a handful of us working with a group of people here. So most of them, they were all from Myanmar. Most of them were weavers. We also had some sewers, and we began teaching them English class. And then they said, we'd like to make money. Can you help us sell the bags? And so eventually this became this really beautiful cooperative that was all led by women. We had one male artisan that came quite a bit, and we had one male translator, but for the most part, it was just a group of women that met often, usually every 2 weeks for about 7 years. And we successfully ended when the last person got a full-time job. So I helped Muna get a job with a friend. She's now a shipping manager at a local fair trade company. She's moving up. She's the team leader. She's just doing exceptionally well. And when that ended, I thought, okay, well, this is it. This has been such a lovely part of my life. I finished my graduate work and moved on to my academic life. And then the rhetoric in Texas and nationally really changed around refugees. And so I began just reaching out to people and said, can I help? Can I tell? Is there anything you want me to do? Can I tell stories in any possible way? And that's really how the writing career began for me. And so it's important to know that, because I want you to understand that I haven't lost contact with Muna. Muna is one of my closest friends. So she's on my Apple phone. When you look it up, she's on my short list of people that I call often. We're going to lunch in a couple of weeks. This wasn't some project that became I went in one time and interviewed one person. I'm not sure I'm ever going to have an experience as beautiful as that again with Muna. I met her about 6 months after the book started. And at the time that I met her, she didn't speak much English. So the interview process for us was us reconstructing the time that I had thought I knew what was happening in her life, and recognizing I had no idea. And as she told the stories, it really filled in so many gaps in our friendship. Now Muna, in many ways, is still doing well. She doesn't have they moved into a new house. She's still in the same job. They're still working. So in the sense that the pandemic has affected all of us, it's been difficult, but none of the major things have happened to her that have happened to a lot of other people. But things have really gotten difficult for her when the coup happened in Myanmar. And so February 2nd, 2021, there was a coup, and she still has family members who are in danger. And as that has happened with a lot of my close friends who live here, the stress of living here and knowing that your country and the people that you care about are in such danger and that the world is not listening has caused deep stress for her and her family. So here in the States, they're both fine, but also very stressed. And for Hasna, I met Hasna in that time period when I was asking people, whose story can I tell? And I got to know a group of Syrians. And the very first time I met Hasna, I thought, we're going to enjoy working together. She's just great. She and I just have a kind of a resonance. And so that the reason I don't read that scene very often, I really have not read it at all, is not because I don't like reading it, it's because it's actually really sad for me. And so part of what I think is so incredibly important to talk, and I know we're gonna talk more about this later, but even though I did as much work as I could to make this read novelistically, these are real people. And it's that moment that the crack really began for Hasna. And so because Hasna and I have spent so much time together and we interviewed every 2 weeks for several hours over almost 2 years. That's the moment that she keeps coming back to. If she could have changed things, if only had been other choices available to her, did she make the right choices? And so Hasna, at the end of the book, her family has been separated by the Muslim ban, and Layla ends up going to another place. I don't want to give all of it away, but they're not able to be reunited. And as of today, that is still the case. So we're hoping at some point this summer that we'll be able to at least get them together for a visit. We're gonna have a travel, if anybody's ever interested, I have a place on my website. You can contact me and talk about helping with the travel fund to help them. But my goal right now is to at least give them a few weeks together. And I'm not sure what that's going to look like. So originally we were hoping that when Biden came into office, that policies would change quickly and that would mean several of their family members could be reunited. And in fact, it looks like it's going to be a much slower process. And so, yeah, things really haven't changed for them very much. And it's really sad.
You talked about being a co-writer with Hasna and Muna, and also described your role as to hide what needs to be hidden and to tell what needs to be told. And further, you pointed out that you wanted to allow for Hasna and Muna to have as much narrative control as possible, privileging their viewpoints of events. This is how you describe it in your afterword. And listening to you talk about the hours, the hundreds of hours, the countless of hours that you have spent interviewing them, and then thinking about that next to what has been your insistence on privileging their view. And I contrast this with perhaps the very quick interviews or absence of interviews that we often see reflected in the press when we read about the stories of refugees and displaced human beings, that often their stories are not present, and there hasn't even been an interview, but they have been represented. So could you talk to us about that part of your approach and this notion of hiding what needs to be hidden and telling what needs to be told, and then this notion of privileging their viewpoint of events, which I think is reflected quite well in the section of the book that you have read. But if you could talk to us more about that kind of narrative situation and in a sense of narrative ethics that you have come to rely on as you tell these stories of others.
Yeah, so my background coming from literature, I think I felt for a bit like I was stepping out. I still to some degree feel like I'm stepping outside of my field in order to do the active writing. So I no longer feel like I'm impersonating a journalist. Now I feel like I can say I'm a journalist because I've spent longer being a journalist than I spent in being employed as an academic. But or at this point, I just feel much more comfortable saying writer, but I just kind of let anybody say whatever it is they need to say. But in doing that, so part of what my background is, I wrote a PhD. My dissertation was about Elizabeth Bishop and her circle, and so it was about mid 20th century Brazilian and American poetry and the ways in which the countries interacted and represented each other to each other. I'm sure there's a better way to say it, but that's like, so I call myself an inter-Americanist. And so this large scale question of how we represent others on both a personal level, but also a systemic level is one that I've been really obsessed with in a variety of different fields across time and through, looking at different time periods. So I brought that into the active writing. And I also brought the sensibility, the awareness that white people have done enormous damage. And I say that because I am white, but people in power have done enormous damage in telling the stories of people who face traditional obstacles to publication. That's, by the way, one of my new favorite words, because I think I'm very tired of us having to talk about underrepresented people or marginalized people. Like we try to make these adjectives fit groups that are very disparate. And so lately I've been thinking, why are we modifying the people? Why not modify the situation? So refugees or former refugees often face obstacles to publication, but they have amazing stories to tell, right? And so for me, that was a gap that I wanted to figure out how to cross in an ethically responsible way. I wanted to do better than so many of the writers that I had studied. And my editor, who is an absolute saint, can tell you like the knowledge of all the ways that I could do damage had me like in a fetal position some days. Like she was like, you just have to write something. It's going to be okay. I just believe in you. She's very good at editing. She's like one part therapist, one part like, editor, thinking about the structure of the book. But so basically I ended up developing a methodology that I think really expands. It draws from sociology and it draws from a bunch of disciplines in order to kind of answer that problem, right? And so as a journalist, I would, like, strictly from a journalism point of view, I would be very objective, and we would have interviews in which I was asking a lot of questions, but staying kind of emotionally not distant, but like, there's like a professional space between me and the conversation. And so while I did ask some questions and was as professional as possible, I also wanted to recognize the fact that I was sitting with one woman who had been a close friend of mine for more than a decade, and one woman who I became incredibly close to. And so for me, those conversations happened over meals as much as possible. Anytime we could eat together, we did. Hasna and Amina, who's the translator who worked with us, and I took turns hosting. And so it became less me as a journalist with all my equipment coming in and asking questions. And I've done that, and that's a different kind of reporting. And more Jessica and Hasna just sitting down at the table. And today I made this, one time I made spaghetti squash for them because I thought Hasna would love it, and she did. One time during Ramadan, I brought a lunch because they were fasting, and I thought, well, I'll eat my lunch later. And Hasna prepared for me the most American feast she could think of. It was homemade pizza, it was this enormous pizza just for me. French fries that she had cut from the potatoes and individually fried for me. I mean, it was just this like amazing feast that was served with such love, right? And so I kind of broke down some of the barriers around journalism. And then sociology or anthropology says that I need to state my subject position in relation to, and like really be clear about my viewpoint when I'm describing people. And so I did that work in the afterword. But I noticed when I was writing the narrative that anytime I put my voice into the narrative itself, that like the gravity of the narrative shifted immediately to look at me instead of, or to like center things from my point of view as opposed to their point of view. And so I ended up deciding that the only place I could situate that and I could do that work was in a separate way at the end. Co-writers often, I blurbed an amazing book that's coming out in October that is a pretty traditional co-writing book in which a former refugee is working with a journalist, and his name is going to be on the cover, but she has interviewed him and kind of turned it into a narrative, and it's written in first person. And because there were so many moving parts, and because I felt such concern about not putting myself in the position of speaking for them, I ended up deciding to make this a third person work. So for me, there were several representational, and part of the reason that I knew what worked is because I tried so many things that didn't work. So I would put myself in the narrative in ways that felt responsible, right? Like I need to tell everybody I was in the room, but in doing that, that didn't work. And so I was really lucky to have both an agent and an editor that let me play with some of those representational ideas to come up with, I think, the thing that felt the best and that best reflected what I wanted to do, which is to feature their work. And when we think about narrative control, we did so many interviews, right? And so they gave me the details that I needed. I feel like I collaged this on. I don't know if any of you used to do this, but like you blow up a balloon and you use paper mache and you kind of collage something, and like piece by piece, you kind of make the sculpture as a kid. That was a bit how this process felt for me. So we would go over a scene, and then Hasna would go back, and the next time I would ask her a lot of questions. What did the dishes look like? What kind of, like, if you were to have a hand towel, what would you do with it? Would you put it here? Would you do it there? And we got to the point where, like, Muna, especially because we've known each other for so long, would be like, okay, so this was my apartment. You walked in, you remember my couch. This is what it looked like. This is what it felt like. These are the things that I smelled. At 5 o'clock, my neighbor would do this. I remember it. So give me those like really kind of visceral details. And so she would begin and kind of set the scene for me, and I'd write it all down, and then we'd kind of enter into the action. There were several moments that were amazing in the interviews that we ended up not putting into the book. And so when I think about hiding what needs to be hidden and telling what needs to be told, at this point, with some exceptions, I think the way that I feel the most comfortable as a representative, I call myself a reluctant mediator for these stories. I feel most comfortable in telling the stories of people who cannot have their stories told because it puts their family in danger. And so I am able to tell the story. I'm working on another column with Catapult right now that's going to be some as told to stories. And anytime there's someone who can tell their own story, I'm really happy to, if I can help connect them with an op-ed or help them pitch it, that's what should happen. So former refugees or people who understand this should be telling the stories in their own words. But there are a group of people that I know because of my relationships whose stories need to be told now because they're urgent and really timely. And so I do the best that I can to kind of fill that gap and to bring those stories in. And I have found that to be kind of the niche that I'm the most comfortable in.
Yeah, and again, in the book, you do direct your readers to the books and texts written by refugees themselves to say, look, you've read my book, but let me tell you what you should also read, right? And I think that's an important move within the text. These chapters, you have us in the apartments, you have us from the vantage point in the kitchens, you have us in spaces where we are able to be present as you reveal those details or that perspective or that agency from Muna and her family. We can witness the tensions, we can witness triumphs, what are seemingly successes, but also certain kinds of disappointments. Right? This is where we find ourselves in reading your book. But you also have alternating within those chapters or those stories. What is a history of US refugee resettlement policy from mid-century, right? Or when the arrival of the United Nations Charter. And in these, it corresponds to what is a claim within the book, and that we must turn to the issue of refugee resettlement in the US and what you call a bellwether of our country's moral center. This was an interesting claim that I found quite powerful, and it struck me because there was a claim made by Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow when she's writing about hyper-incarceration in the United States. And she's also appealing to what is the need for a moral and spiritual revolution in our country. So you are appealing to or understanding the country's moral center. So I wonder if you could talk to us about this moral center that you are appealing to. Do we have a moral center, or what is that moral center that you are appealing to? So to talk to us about the decision and how those chapters on refugee resettlement and its history and its evolution work within the text, and then this appeal to that moral center within the nation.
So when I set out to write those chapters, my study before this, the time period that I was most familiar with was the post-World War II, early Cold War time period. And so I knew that was a time period, while I was doing my research on Elizabeth Bishop and issues of representation and who was traveling and what rhetoric was happening at the time for travel writers. I was also very aware of how refugees were being brought to the United States. And so I did some study just kind of on my own because I was fascinated about the beginning of the refugee resettlement program. And it didn't officially begin until 1980, but many of the policies began after World War II. So when I started those history chapters, I thought this would be a history of refugee policy. At the same time, when I began doing the research, what I realized is it's not a history of refugee policy. It's a history of how the United States views refugees and therefore how those views impact policy. And so when we think about this in terms of moral center, I think we're at a time of real really wrestling with American identity. And I think it's actually really important for us, those of us who are in the United States, to recognize that the ongoing conversations about American identity are not ones that that are new, that this isn't new to each age, but that they're part of kind of a longer arc that have been happening since the beginning of the US, and that who we are as a country, what we value, and therefore what policies we have in a variety of ways. And so I think the new Jim Crow is a great example of this, that these are very connected questions that we tend to think of as very separate. Like, this is about immigration, but this is about this thing, and this is about, you know, incarceration, and all of these are very different. There's always a danger in making an argument about moral sinners or about the soul of our nation. It's the kind of stuff that sounds great, and every op-ed I have ever published has some ending where the editor is like, and now like bring it home. And so there's some of that, to me, feels empty. But this one actually felt really important. And I'm still kind of parsing through why. Part of this, and we can talk a little bit about my next book. My next book covers the history of the United States. Basically, it's like much longer scope. And I've noticed that the two different sides of the US that are often kind of pushed and pulled are capitalism and democracy. So like, capitalism feels very American and democracy feels very American. And yet both of those are, and we've exported them to the world. And yet both of those are really at odds with each other when we think about the side of ourselves that it's appealing to as a nation. And so I think it's always very hard. You know, we can get into Benedict Anderson and imagined communities. Like, there's no way that you can have some large scale view of all of us as Americans, because there are millions and millions of us, and each of us have a very different view of what that means. But when we start thinking about policies that are based just on common good, policies that are just based on humanitarian concerns, the only way that refugee resettlement is ever, the US public is going to change its mind on refugee resettlement based on history, because the only time the US public has ever changed its mind is when we appeal to them, like a higher sense of ourselves. We do this because it's the right thing to do. And so I think there's always a tension in that representation. We want people to understand what's at stake for former refugees and for people who are currently displaced. And we don't want to tell stories that are just appealing to their sense of sympathy, and like it gets into those tropes that we often talk about. And so for me, I feel like the center, like recognizing that this is a moral question and it is a question of American identity, that those two things have to be part and parcel of a large scale conversation when we think about refugee policy. Otherwise, we just think about laws and we just think about like what presidents have done, and those things, presidents are only respond reactively to their sense of what the American public actually wants.
Well, thank you. And certainly I understand the importance of those appeals, and often rely on that rhetoric myself. So point taken. You referenced those kinds of tropes that emerge about refugees, or the ways in which stereotypes circulate within the press, or also the academy, or right, wherever we turn. And there's a section where you're writing about the My La camp, and you talk about how it became to be known as the hill tribes, or right, and you give the list of missionaries, tourists, anthropologists, and teachers who came to create these kinds of terms. And could you talk about right, how you work in your own writing to avoid these kinds of tropes and stereotypes, and the kinds of, as you talked about, that in many ways, some of the ways in which you approach your work have come through your own lessons that you've learned through, practice, things that maybe you have done that you would want to do differently in the future. But perhaps talk about some of the challenges that emerged because of the ways in which these stereotypes and tropes are everywhere within our culture and society, and how one goes about avoiding them when writing about refugee experiences or representing others.
I think the best way to avoid tropes is to have refugees and former refugees and current displaced people speaking for themselves. They don't, I have never met anyone who well, that's not true. There is some way in which so many people who have practiced telling their stories for Western audiences, and by Western, I hate the word Western. There's not really a good word for the asylum granting or refugee granting countries, and so maybe refugee granting. I'm going to go with that adjective. So they have an example is I did an interview for a piece last year, I think, with someone who was from Congo, and he began his story with the most salacious part, and I won't get into all of it, but like, when the soldiers came, this is what happened, and like it just kind of began with this like almost sensational view. And I, at a few sentences in, just was like, can we just start over? Tell me where you're from. Tell me where you grew up. And it was the story that he wanted to tell, or the story that kind of came out about his life, was very different from the story that he had been trained by the expectation of the resettlement process to as being the most important. And I think like one of the best books about this is Dina Nayeri's The Ungrateful Refugee. And she, as someone who is a former refugee herself, really unpacks the process in which stories are packaged and how they're how refugees are taught they should be telling their stories, and literally taught by people in the camps who are suggesting ways that they can be believed in order to get resettlement processes. And the refugee support centers are listening for a particular kind of story. And there are so many points at which this is deeply problematic, right? And so we could run the gamut of the entire system. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is to have people telling the stories themselves. One of the things that I did in this book is, just begin reading a bunch of books, and I realized how often the stories begin with a journey. So we expect someone in a boat, someone crossing a desert, someone who like the missiles are fleeing behind them. And it's that like very American movie portrayal of like, they're running through the night and they're backlit by the missiles. And part of what I wanted to do was show the leaving of the country was a very short thing. And in fact, I played with that trope a little bit, and having Hasna, I began with that on purpose because I wanted Muna leaving the country to be the kind of expected trope. And then that was it. We didn't talk about that for the rest of the time, or it only came up as it came up in Muna's memory. So that is not the story. That was just the tiniest part of the story. And the real story was her whole life before and after that, right? And so there are dangers of this kind of, I feel like when I write, I do as much as I can try to keep things, each of my stories centered on the people who are telling me their story. And yet sometimes there are dangers. I don't always get to write entire narratives about every person that I interview, and I wish I could. I wish I had a volume of books that were just as long as this first one. But I think part of what I try to do is work with editors and avoid a lot of the tropes that they're looking for. So there's like a moment in every op-ed where it's like, okay, now we need kind of the sob story, and then we need to like the turn, and we need to move it. And those are the things, like recognizing what those stereotypes are and pushing back against that, and not privileging writers who do that, and making sure that the voices of the people are actually centered. That's not always easy work, but I think it's really important. And I think part of the thing that we need to do is continue to educate people about the kinds of stories that can be told. It's actually, I think, one of the great ironies that comes from creative writing. Something is really universal the more specific it is, right? So the more that you get into the details of a very quirky individual story, the more it feels like something that I can connect with, right? If it's just a type, then it just feels kind of flat and shallow. And so part of in writing this book, in really getting into the very granular details of their lives, my hope is that it connects with people better, and that you don't see them as, they are victims to some degree of the things they went through, but the two women and all the people that I interview are also extraordinarily good at overcoming ridiculous and complicated circumstances. And some of the people that I know aren't that nice. Like, they don't have to be these like noble characters, and some of them are kind of mean, but they've been through a lot, and I understand why they're a little bit crabby, and so these are just people, and I want to be able to do what I can to show them as much as I can in their complexity and in their like really individual specific moments.
Yeah, and I certainly can see that coming out in the book. In the book, we see Muna and Hasna having encounters with many different groups and individuals, whether it be UNHCR workers, translators, in Austin with local NGOs and groups that they work with, so that throughout the book, you are writing about their experiences, but then you are also writing and giving us an account of their experiences with others, both when they are at home, but also when they come to the United States. What have you learned about those encounters and the ways in which they were received when they came to the United States, and particularly in the context of Austin and in Texas, what you observed when you saw them encountering or in contact with the communities in which they were there to live in when they arrived in the United States. What did you encounter, and what did it tell you about the possibilities for the United States having that kind of moral shift or change that you allude to or that you call for in the book?
So part of why I picked these two women out of the many stories that I did somebody called it the other day, an audition process. And there was a bit of that, of like, I did a lot of interviews to kind of figure out early, like Muna was a given. That was someone that whose story I knew and someone I knew I could connect with. But I really wanted to tell another story. At one point in the book proposal, when we sold the book at auction, it had 4 different stories. And part of why I liked my editor is she was like, you may have 2. She's very good at like cutting me and putting me in appropriate boxes. But cutting my words, not me as a person. The reason that we picked Hasna's is because we wanted to show Muna's story of, it as difficult and complicated as resettlement was. It was about as picture perfect as it could be. The system worked beautifully. It worked as it was supposed to. It was still very difficult, and I think in a way that most people who don't understand much about US resettlement might not realize it's difficult. I think I know this because it was I misconstrued what resettlement was and assumed that like, okay, you got here, you're safe, everything's great, this should be good. So those are the thoughts that I had when I first began this work as well. I was maybe a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. So we wanted to show everything worked well and it's still really complicated. And then we wanted to show who we became as a nation in the years between when Muna arrived and when Hasna arrived. And I think the drastic shift in how we talk about refugees, particularly how it affects people who are coming from the Middle East and from African countries, as well as some people from Myanmar and there are a handful of other places, it has really created a very different narrative. And so Hasna, if she were here, would tell you she's very grateful. She's very glad for the United States. Anytime we've been in a kind of a public setting, which is not often because they can't join me for any of these events, she'll talk about like, yeah, this was great. I'm so glad. Thank you very much. Behind closed doors, after about a year, she revealed a lot of the harder things. And I think comparing the two and the many other versions I'd heard, the receptions I'd heard from other people and had seen myself, what Syrians faced, particularly coming over in 2015, 2016, even early 2017, was just so difficult. And it still to this day brings me such grief that they who are the victims of this massive, horrendous campaign by their government to kill civilians and have fled because what other choice do they have, continue to receive such hostility around the world. And I think it's such a misunderstood situation. And I think just watching her, she had people spit at her, she had people tell her horrible things, and she also had people smile and really welcome her. But it was not the kind of loving and beautiful bipartisan, churches and all these different groups that kind of coming around to help that I witnessed firsthand when many of the people came over from Myanmar in the mid 2000s. And so I think the shift of that is something I think we haven't always registered. It feels, sometimes it's hard not to feel like things have always been this way. Like it was not always this way. When in 1980, when the Refugee Act passed, the Senate passed with unanimous bipartisan support. Like every senator was like, yes, we absolutely need to support refugees. And I just could not believe that fact because I can't imagine any immigration act passing the Senate unanimously at this point. And so there was definitely a time just a few decades ago when everybody supported refugees. Every president that I looked at had all these major speeches around refugees. This was not an issue that people were worried about or concerned about. This was definitely not a polarizing issue. And so I think that there is hope in that. If we look back historically, we've had real moments. The 1920s and 1930s were moments of real xenophobia, real fear, real closing of the doors, isolationism, fear of people coming to take our jobs. A lot of the same fears come up over and over and over again in different rhetoric and like slightly different flavors. So we're seeing a lot of that happening right now. What shifted it was World War II and the realization of what it meant to, like, what genocide meant. And there was the sense of like, never again, we're never again going to allow people to be in this space. And of course, we know that the 20th century was in many ways the century of genocide, and we allowed genocide to happen in so many different places. And so I don't know what it's going to take for us to come out of this. I think we will. I think it's going to take massive education. I think this generation who's growing up now watching the polarization and the like really dehumanizing language. I know my own children have a very different view of the world and are much more politically engaged than I ever was as a, late elementary school kid. And I just wonder if it's going to take a few years or a couple of decades for us to get back there. I don't know. And I don't know if we can or if we will. I have hope that we do, having studied the history of these major these major shifts. But yeah, it's a pretty difficult time. So I'm not sure what this is going to look like in the US moving forward.
It is indeed difficult to predict. This notion of humanitarian language and also US political interests, right? And the way in which this has impacted refugee policies, and also who is chosen or is privileged in being attended to in terms of addressing the issues and the needs of refugees and displaced persons. In the book, you pay a lot of attention to this over the course of the 20th century, and indeed call out those moments in which the emphasis on whiteness, right, was something that dictated the ways in which policy was made and who would be given privileges over others. And then you move across the 20th century and move it through US policy as it relates to respective presidencies. And you talk about the Obama administration, and you also turn to what is after the Obama administration, right? But now we see that with a change in Washington, that there has been some turn toward trying to answer this question or address this issue of a kind of moral or spiritual turn. I wonder if you could talk about that in terms of the political, since it's something you address in the book, and does the current change in administration offer a possibility for addressing some of the needs that you call out in the book?
One would wish. So I will tell you that I am pretty sad and frustrated about what has happened so far under the Biden administration. In there was a lot of talk. It was one of the major bullet points in every speech that he would give, talking about returning to refugee resettlement. And I have, been chronicling. So I come to this both kind of journalistically, but also as an advocate and someone who has reached out and been in connection with refugee resettlement agencies all over the country. I have done just dozens of virtual events with agencies at this point, and it has been so fruitful. And in some ways, I feel free to criticize. I'm hearing, but of course, people often are not able to say politically because of their own nonprofit status and because they want to make sure they're working with the administration. There's deep frustration right now, and deep, I think it almost feels like betrayal. What happened under the Biden administration. So there was such great hope. It was one of the very first initiatives that he signed, that he would raise the refugee cap. And then there's this big moment where like Blinken and Mayorkas and some others went to Congress and said, like, this is a priority. And then there was nothing. And then there was a day on April 16th when he lowered the cap to 15,000. And then immediately after there was an outcry, the White House reached out to some resettlement agencies and refugee stakeholders and said, actually, we'll try to do a little bit better, basically. So they have a plan in place. Right now, I feel like we'll see. I think it is going to take it is going to take centering this for refugee resettlement to be rebuilt. I don't think refugee resettlement was anywhere near perfect before it was destroyed. The metaphor I have often used is that if refugee resettlement were a house, that like one of the walls needed to be taken out in order to fix the house. And instead the Trump administration blew the whole house up. So wall got taken out. So I guess we fixed that. But now as we rebuild this basically from the foundation up, there's so much work that needs to be done. And yet there's a little part of me that is, I'm not glad about it. I'm not glad we are at the place that we are, but there is an opportunity here for us to do better, for us to have better conversations. It feels like a really critical time for the work that you're doing and that others are doing in order for us to really inform people of what it means to be a refugee, what the differences are between people who are refugees and other immigration groups, and yet the connections, that these are not separate silos, that there are points of connection between these. And I think this kind of public advocacy is really important, in part because the Biden administration really seems to be listening in a way that the Trump administration was not. So the thing that I feel the most hope about is that after there was an outcry, the Biden administration responded basically immediately. So I'm hopeful at this point that this can be a moment when those of us who really care about refugees really can reach out to our elected officials and demand that they do some of the work that we think is really important. I don't think refugee resettlement is the answer to everything, but I also think at this point, we need to begin the work of bringing people who have been in the process for years. We need to begin starting this again and really financing it and making this, rebuilding it in order for us to kind of fix some of the things that need to be fixed as well.
Yes, I mean, to fix things that the United States is responsible for causing violence and terror in regards to, so certainly. You have worked in the academy, you are trained in the academy, you have your PhD in literature, and now you are working in the form of nonfiction. And the collective, the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, is a collective of scholars who have published widely and have pushed forward the field of critical refugee studies so that it takes what could be seen as the good of the academy, but also privileges refugees at the center and refugee knowledge production, so as to critique those very parts of the academy that are problematic and have become part of what has led to many of the problems before us. So could you talk about your work in the academy and the move to then write in nonfiction? And do you still draw from the academy as you are doing your work? And if so, you know, what fields, and if not, what is it that has stopped you from doing that? Or talk about your relationship between the academy, but also writing in the journalism there.
Yeah, there's a restaurant in Austin called Uchi, which is like one of those 5-star Michelin fine dining restaurants. I've only had appetizers there one time, but it's the kind of place where that has these like little plates where everything is like, you just get this like tiny spoonful of something, and that's supposed to be this like amazing gastro experience. I don't even know the words. I feel like as a person in the academy, the metaphor that I've used is that I was trained to be a sous chef at Uchi, and instead I decided to take those skills and start my own fusion food truck. And so everything that I'm doing, all the history, all the research, all the narrative, the issues of representation, all of that draws from, I couldn't have done this work if I had not done the PhD. It taught me how to think, it taught me how to read well, it taught me how to thoughtfully, it taught me all the issues with all the people who have done this work before me and how many times this has been done poorly. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that knowledge. Working outside of the academy gives me such freedom to say some of the things that I really want to say. And so for a long time, I sort of was sad not to be back in the academy. And yet now I feel a real freedom around that. And I feel like when I think about disciplines, one of my jobs was as a writing center director, and I helped develop this interdisciplinary set of guides to various disciplines. And I have thought about that a lot because it has really helped me kind of as I move forward, like I said about journalism and all these other places. And so I think sometimes I'm very cognizant of what is literary scholar, Jessica, and then what is like me pulling from all these other places. This is what psychologists might say, or this is what other people might say. And so I think this is what is actually really great about wide education for those of you who are in undergraduate or graduate studies, as all of these classes that you're taking that seem like they may not fit actually really work together in creating the person that you are and the viewpoint that you are. And for me, that has been just an incredibly rich part of writing.
So I just want to, my role as a timekeeper, to also draw your attention to the fact that we are at about 4:10 or 4:12, and that we have 3 questions for in line on the Q&A pipeline. So, that just want to flag you to that.
Thank you. Yes, so we should open this up, and please submit your questions, and we can certainly bring those into the dialogue. There are a couple of questions here, and I'll read them, Jessica, for you, and also for the audience. How do you balance the emotional side with the analytic side in your writing and action? Great question. And perhaps I'll offer another question that has been presented. This says, I am a refugee, and I always want to cry when I talk about my story. What are some challenges you have experienced while interviewing refugees regarding their mental health? So
I'm so glad you shared those. Yeah, that's right. Well, I think that there are 2 different ways to think about this. And I think the first one is the most important. And I think that is in the people who are telling the stories. So I would be the receiver of the stories, and these are the tellers of the stories, right? I cannot speak as someone who is a teller of the story, but having sat across the table from so many people who have told their stories, there are a couple of things that I think are really important. There's an old nonfiction adage that we use. Some people attribute it to Mary Carr, but other people have said it's from someone else. But I still like the idea, even if I don't know who said it originally, is to write from your scars and not your wounds. And I have found that to be very true when I listen to stories. So Muna she didn't write, but she told her stories out of her scars. Like when she crossed the border, she was a child. She could speak very objectively and move across kind of through time and space. This is what was happening. These are the things that were happening. Now that her family is in danger in Myanmar, these are wounds again. What had been scars became wounds. And so the conversations I had with her even a few years ago might feel very different in this time period. And so I think addressing that issue of crying all the time, I think that is such an appropriate response. And I think you as the teller of the story, or whoever I am interviewing, those can only be the people, they're the ones who know if it's appropriate, if they want it to be told, if they shouldn't do that work. And so something that I try very, very hard not to do is never depress. I mean, I can't tell you how many recordings I have of my own voice in which I give a 5-minute caveat of like, if there's not anything, if you don't want to talk about this, if I get too close to something, to the point that my friends who know me are just like roll their eyes and they're like, yeah, I want to tell you the story. Let's just kind of move on. But I think it's actually really important that this is something that that tellers of the story are not doing because they feel like they have to, but because they want to, because they're in a place where this is their story and they want to tell it. And I don't know how to do that work. That is work that I think is best done with therapists and best done in community and best done with friends. I will tell you, I've seen when people do that work well, and I think there is a moment that it feels very empowering, especially to the women that I've often interviewed, who usually it's men who are interviewed for stories about war. And I have found that asking questions for women can be very empowering. There are times when I think tears are healing, and I think it's really good. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm receiving other people's, like some of the most painful things in their life. And I hold these, so it's very sacred to me. This is something very tender that happens in our conversations. Right now I'm doing a series of stories out of Myanmar, and I am so devastated by what I'm hearing. And I feel so compelled to tell these stories, and people so desperately want others to know what's happening. There's like a real urgency around it, right? And so I think just recognizing the combination of pain and trauma and urgency, and my goal in that always is to ask people, what are you hoping for from this interview, right? Like I can't change the world. I wish I could. Your story, as much as I wish it would like change everything, might not, but what are you hoping I can do? And then for me, I just think as a receiver, I am so grateful for a good therapist and good friends and others who have helped me balance this. It is a thing I wrestle with all the time. As a journalist, I should have this kind of Teflon skin. I should be really objective in going into these conversations. And to some degree, I've had to develop this. I have to separate myself from what's happening. I think the same way that therapists and doctors have to like have hard things, but then move on. But there's a point at which I'm not sure I'm ready to, I don't really want to lose the empathy either. I don't want to lose the ability to connect with others. And so I think there's always going to be that tension of responding empathetically without letting it take over my own emotional health. That I think, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It's something I think being aware of is and being really intentional about can be really important.
Thank you, Jessica. There is a question that to have additional information on the lives of the families and Hasna and Muna in the book since the end of the book. So can we get an update on their lives since the end of the book is the question. And the subsequent question, was Hasna able to have other family members live near her?
I think we addressed this a little bit at the beginning, but in a short answer, everybody's basically where they were. There are very few changes, and no, Hasna still not been able to have her family members near her. So at this point, everybody is basically kind of still in the same situation. And in fact, I really had hoped that, you know, I'll be honest, that I hoped that this book would maybe not change the world, but at least change their stories, and that there might be, you know, none of us foresaw that this book coming out in the middle of a pandemic. And so I'm still hopeful that in the next year or so, we're going to be able to reunite her with at least some of her family members, but the chances of their entire family being all together are slim to none. And there's just such grief in that.
There's a question. The question is, I'm interested in how you, this is a question from May. I'm interested in how you weave personal stories into a non-fiction writing, but with such literary flow. Can you share your writing process and advice? How do you know what parts of the interview to include, exclude, etc., and how to write about it?
So in a nutshell, this is the hardest thing about writing a book like this, because I mean, I have thousands of pages of transcriptions from interviews with Hasna and Muna. So part of what I did in the middle of this, I don't know if any of you have seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So that came out on Amazon Prime. I am always looking for kind of escapist books and movies, especially in the middle of like interviews like this, because it can be so difficult and painful. So I was watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and I thought, this is beautifully written in terms of the narrative arc. Like the narrative arc of this is exactly the narrative arc I would hope to be able to give in Muna's story. And so in doing that, I really just went through the episodes and charted at what point the characters began to kind of, you know, like they established their place and then they began to kind of make some moves. There's always like an inciting incident. So, and I have friends who are screenwriters, so I asked them for some advice in terms of how to have a script. And so basically it's like I built a frame, and then I took their stories and applied it to the frames. And so, and I see it in my office, I can't show you, but I took like 8 to 10 pieces of paper and taped it up against the wall. And I just wrote down, like, this is what's happening with Hasna, this is what's happening with the history, this is what's happening with Muna, and then began to kind of notice the points of connection. And so I wanted the history sections to feel like a coming of age of our country. I wanted Muna's sense of her own empowerment to kind of begin. So I started putting some of her memories in places where it's like she was beginning to find that there was empowerment, and then she had a memory, and then that would bring her to a greater point. So I wanted her narrative and Hasna's narrative to kind of work together in tandem. And I think that for me was the most helpful way to think through. It's not just the stories that they tell. So there's so many stories that are, I mean, I could have written 8 books about Hasna alone, and she probably would have been happiest if I had. Like she's very disappointed I didn't get to her great grandparents, because there's just a lot happening like 4 generations back, and you know, you just can't include all of that. So for me, recognizing the importance of a frame like that, and then that kind of helped me make some decisions about what to include and what not to include. And that's kind of how the 3 parts really work together.
question. I appreciate what you've said about co-authorship and narrative choices. This conversation has me thinking about those ethics and also about the potential and varied impacts narratives have as they circulate. Could you say more about what audience you had in mind as you were writing the book? And what have you learned about audiences the book is reaching? And I think this is related to the next question, which is, what are the main takeaways you want readers to sit with after reading your book?
So I am a liberal person who lives in Texas, and I grew up here in Texas for much of my life, and spent several years of my life living out in West Texas. So, and then I have lived abroad. So I am someone who who really enjoys complexity, and I enjoy people who have disparate points of view. When I was writing this book, I did not want this to be a book just for an audience that agreed with me, nor did I want this to be a book that was just for an audience that was hostile to my views. As much as possible, I wanted to ask some questions that I thought were really important. So when I think about the main takeaways of this book, they vary a bit for audience. I wanted my conservative neighbors, I wanted them, and actually they have, and I'll tell you a little bit about this experience in a minute, but I wanted them to so I pictured my conservative neighbors, and I wanted them to read the story and then to leave thinking, we can't care more for a Christian woman from Myanmar than we do a Muslim woman from Syria. Both of these women are worthy of love, are worthy of safety, are worthy of being with their families. And therefore we can't have policies that only allow Christians to come over, or that care more about a certain type of person than another. And then for audiences that are kind of dismissive, or like feel like they know a lot about these issues, I wanted to allow the complexity of the people really to come through. And so part of what's interesting to me, and I didn't intend for this to happen, I'm very critical of George Bush's policies in Iraq, but his policies when it comes to Myanmar were pretty good. There was some definite moments there, and there were some real issues, but there were, in writing this book, I wanted to show the complexity of presidential policies. And there were some policies that allowed people to come over. They changed. There was one rule that didn't allow people who were like basically reacting to the top Madal, they wouldn't allow them to come over to the US. And in changing that, they brought so many people to safety that really deserve that. And I'm very critical of the Obama administration's handling of Syria. And I think that there are millions of lives that did not have to be lost that were. And so part of what I wanted to do was not to have these kind of party line conversations. So really, when I think about this, I want us to have better and more complex stories told. I want us to really understand what refugee resettlement means. This is not a book about every refugee around the world. It's very specific to refugee resettlement in the United States. And what we're thinking through and wrestling with right now in terms of our own policies is very different from what's happening in other places in the world, though there are, of course, corollaries. But I wanted us as a nation, and I wanted my readers to understand more fully how we got to this point, how this fits into like historical shifts that have happened, but also keep the lives of complex people at the center of our conversations.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm, there are moments in the book where you are talking about terms that are important for the characters that appear in the book, or for the people that you interview. You were referring to the Somali language. You are being very, very careful to tell the details of greetings, right, of respective cultures. I mean, painstakingly so it appears, right, and when reading the book. And I think this is vitally important, even the way in which you are talking about the circulation of gossip in certain realms and what it means. So there's an intense emphasis on details, and it does demonstrate that there is this radical listening taking place by you as you are what appears and it seems clear, is that you understand it as an honor to be told these stories, or to be present as the stories are unveiled. And I think that is a strength that really emerges in the book. And it's from those stories, right, that one is able to start to see the importance of the knowledge production that is at the center. So I think that is quite remarkable in your work. I would like to ask, as we come near close, about what you're working on now. So one, if you could tell us about what you're working on now, but also, since you allude to this and you give us many texts or ways to read the work of refugees and to read the work of others that you find important. And also in the book, you cite many thinkers like Wynne and others who are writing about refugees, both in writing about their stories. If you could talk to us about, right, the kind of work that you immerse yourself in, the writing that you are reading and that you find valuable and important, and then to tell us what you are working on now.
Yeah. So I'm cognizant of the fact that I only have a couple of minutes before we do the raffle, so I'll make it brief. There's one more question in the chat, and I wanted to address this as well. So talking about refugees finding a way to write or tell their own stories in the language, which May is asking, do you think it's important to imagine that refugees could both write and publish their own stories and experience, and this would look like in the professional publishing world, which I think exactly correlates with what you're asking. So I'll answer the question first about the kind of books and the ways that educators can do this. And I'll say that rather than giving you a list of titles in the back of the book, I have the books that I read, and there are so many others. I have found a few rules of thumb that I have in place. I, as much as possible, read books in the original, either in the original language and then translated, or that were written firsthand by former refugees, or that were written with co-writers who partner closely with them in making sure that they bring their stories. I have yet to find a fiction work written by an outsider that I feel like does this work well. It may be possible, so I leave room for the potential for this to happen. But when there are so many excellent examples of poetry and nonfiction and fiction written by former refugees and displaced people themselves, why would outsiders need to write fiction in which they try to understand this? We just need to read the fiction of people who understand it themselves, right? And so for me, those are the kind of like ethically, highly researched, journalistic, nonfiction, or as much as possible centering the voices of people is kind of my rule of thumb. And my next book, I know we've got the raffle, is called We Were Illegal. And it's looking at my own family's history here in the border. I just had so many questions in writing this very limited book about refugees, about my own family's journey coming to the United States and the ways that we have often talked about people here in Texas. And so I'm going back 8 generations to look at how we came to the US, and I have found so many secrets and just really incredible stories of really damaging and horrific things that white people have done. And those white people are my own family members, and some extraordinary stories of people whose lives my family affected, who I think have not been centered and told. So that's what I'm going to be working on next year. I'm supposed to get my manuscript to my editor next July, and it's a very intense writing process. So that's what I'm going to be working on moving forward.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for reading from After the Last Border, and thank you for being gracious enough to answer our questions and be in dialogue with us. We hope this is a dialogue that continues.
Me too. Thank you, guys.
We did have a raffle, yes, and the winners of the raffle, Mei Yang, Caitlin Rollin, and Allison Miyashiro. Please forgive my pronunciation. And we will be contacting you all if we can obtain your mailing addresses so we can deliver the prizes to you. Yes. I'd like to turn the Zoom back to Dr. Um. Uh,
Oh, speechless. Thank you so much, Jessica, for the wonderful panel. For the conversation and certainly the book reading, great reflections, and I learned so much, and certainly walk away from all of this with more to think about. So profound gratitude for all of your sharing. Also, a profound thank you to Nigel, for your very able and thought-provoking facilitation as well. So thank you for that, and of course to the audience, for your very wonderful questions that you posed. So a lot of things to think about, and Jessica, looking so forward to your future work, and to certainly, we're your biggest fan here, so and looking forward to having you back with us for future conversations. So please join me once again with a round of applause for the panelists, and also to all those who made this event possible. And thank you to the audience for your presence this afternoon.
Thank you all. This was wonderful.
And that brings us to the conclusion of the program. Have a good afternoon.